it's Rachel. Today on Crack Your Bible, we are going to be talking about Bible symbolism. I haven't done one of these videos in a really long time, so before we get started, make sure you hit subscribe with the bell with the parentheses so you're notified of a new gospel message, because of course Satan and YouTube and Google, they don't want you to know the gospel, so just jump through their hoops, hit subscribe with the bell with the parentheses, and let's get started. Now, if you saw Philip DeFranco's show today, you will have known that even he is saying that his subscribers are not getting notified, even though they go through all the rigmarole of subscribing and the bell and everything. So he said, hey, follow me on Twitter, and I will always post the link when I go live of my video. Likewise, I always do the same, so if you want to check me out in case you're not getting the notifications at every single social media platform, it is at Rachel in Stevens, and I always post it on Twitter and Google Plus whenever I post a brand new video, in case you're not getting the notifications. But anyway, what we are going to be talking about is leaven, because I always like to do a Bible symbolism video, because a lot of times there's analogies and metaphors that are agricultural that a lot of people just don't understand today. So I decided that I was actually going to make some leavened bread, and my yeast was kind of old, so it didn't puff up as much as I wanted to, but I made aish baldi, which is an Egyptian bread, and it's kind of like pita bread, where it forms the pocket. My bread actually did form the pocket, even though I couldn't get it to puff in the oven. But the reason that I wanted to talk about this is because not only are we talking about sin, we talked about that with Abraham and how, his little white lie where it's like, oh, just tell Pharaoh that you're my sister, not my wife/niece, has created so many problems that sin has permeated everything, where now we're still dealing with the consequences of that sin 5,000 years later with the descendants of Ishmael and the descendants of Isaac. Likewise, when I was talking about domestic violence last week, I talked about how in 1 Corinthians 5, how Paul said, hey, a little leaven spoils the whole lump. You have to break away from that because, yes, God loves you, but when there is sin in your life, and it is so egregious that it's like, oh, I don't even care, you had to put that person out for the destruction of their flesh. So they're handed over to Satan, and you can't brag about it, you can't boast about it. So that is what we are going to be talking about today, because I want people to understand what yeast is. And yeast is a one-celled fungus. It is something that is naturally occurring. It is everywhere. And it is so important that we talk about this, because Passover is coming up at the end of March 2018. And then the very next day is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So 7 days of eating unleavened bread. And if we don't know what leaven is, if we don't understand this, then that doesn't make sense. These metaphors and analogies that are brought up in the Bible, they don't really make sense. And then we don't understand how serious God takes sin, how it just permeates our lives. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. So let's look at what yeast does, and then later on this week and then in the following weeks, we will talk more about yeast and sin and Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But let's get this one out of the way, because we've already brought it up in other videos, and not everybody makes bread. I mean, I barely had any yeast in my house because my husband is like very anti-gluten. So let's check that out right now.
Now, the ancient Israelites would have used wild yeast back in Egypt, and luckily we have commercial farming today which produces yeast. They're all fungi. It's all the same kind of stuff. One's wild, one's factory farmed. It's the same thing. So don't get it twisted when people are like, oh no, yeast means something completely different in the Bible. Leavening isn't yeast, blah, 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 blah. It's all symbolic. That's why we're here today. So we take this commercial yeast. It's a one-celled organism. It's a fungi. You add in some sugar and some water, and as that yeast begins to feed on sugar energy, it produces carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide is a gas, so it starts to puff up the medium that it is in. So the yeast and the water start to bubble up. Likewise, with sin, you will see a puffing up of a person. But the puffing up is not the cause of sin, rather it's the symptom of sin. So when you have sin that comes into your life, as it starts to feed on your energy and the good, sweet things in your life, it will begin to produce toxic gases, which then puff you up. Likewise, you see in this yeast mixture, you begin to see the bubbles. After time, it grows more and more and more things begin to die off, and now it's really puffy and gross looking. So you're going to add this to your flour mixture, and now that it's added in, there's no way of removing any of that yeast. There's no way I can strain it out. I added some salt and water, and now we are going to have our baldy bread. So as I'm stirring it around, this is just going to replicate more and more yeast. It's going to continue to grow as there's more carbohydrates in the bread, and it is going to start breaking down different phytoestrogens, phytates, lecithins, all sorts of things that are present in grain. And what yeast does through fermentation is it allows you to eat things that are not necessarily good for you. It makes things more palatable, so you don't immediately have the symptoms of like, oh, I just ate something really bad for myself and it's going to tear me up inside. That's why you see people who are gluten-free today. They don't want to deal with the intestinal issues that come from eating breads. Now, unfortunately, this is something that sin does to us. It makes things that we have no business consuming more palatable. So while on the outside it seems like, oh, I can eat this. This tastes good because it's been processed. Here you see that the bread has been puffed up quite a lot. It's grown. All of a sudden it's like, oh, I don't feel so good on the inside, because over time, the more of the stuff that you eat, whether it's bread or it's extremely fermented food like kimchi or sauerkraut, you will have intestinal damage. And this is exactly what sin does to us. It allows us to eat things that we shouldn't be eating, and then it tears us up on the inside, where at the beginning it doesn't look so bad, but now all of a sudden we're puffed up, we're full of sin, we're full of these toxic gases, which are the result of spiritual death. Yeast, it's eating up all that good stuff inside of us, it's zapping all of our energy, and it produces death. That death produces gases, which then turn around and puff things up. And I want people to recognize that that is what sin does to us. Not only is it one cell that replicates until it's just taken over everything, you cannot get rid of it, but it feeds on the good things, produces death. That death produces toxic gas. That gas puffs things up. That leavening allows you to enjoy foods that you have no business enjoying. And then once you eat them, it tears you up inside. It's going to cause problems for you. Likewise, when you have a little bit of sin that creeps in, just one crumb, one cell that creeps in, all of a sudden, you are going to have spiritual death. And as it feeds on the good things in your life, it is going to produce spiritual death. And that spiritual death, the more spiritually dead you become, the more puffed up, the more conceited, the more prideful and arrogant you become. And the more prideful and arrogant you become, the more it's going to tear you up inside. So it's completely symbolic. Some of these things, there's no way the Israelites would have understood, because some of this has only come about through modern science that we even know these things, but we see God's symbolism in yeast. God doesn't tell us don't do this for no other reason. God knows all these things beforehand when he tells us not to do these things. So that is what leavening is. It is just another word for something that leavens bread, something that puffs something up, that produces this spiritual death. So that's all that I wanted to share with you. I hope you will like, subscribe, and share, and I will see you later. Bye. My hands are covered in butter and honey, but I couldn't get the bread to puff up while it was cooking because the yeast is pretty old, but it does open up just like a pita pocket does. This is Egyptian baladi, and this is something that the Israelites would have been aware of. This is the kind of yeast bread that they were told, don't make, you don't have time. So there you go. It puffs up just like pita bread.
That is Egyptian biladi covered in butter and honey.